Welcome in. Let's go. It's another episode of the Wobcast 2.0, the season 2 premiere of the Wobcast 2.0. And I am your host, Mike Wobschall, Wobby, joined as always by Gyles. We will bring him in a moment. But first, want to welcome all of you back, especially those of you who listened to season 1 of the Wobcast 2.0 as we made our return to the podcasting arena to join Vikings conversation with you all. It was a fun opening season of the Wobcast 2.0, and we are looking forward to season 2, which begins with what will certainly be an exciting and eventful and change-laden offseason for your Minnesota Vikings. And so the first, 10, 12, 15 episodes or so will chronicle all of that. We'll predict all of that, and we'll opine on all of that as yours truly and Gyles and executive producer Chase join you weekly on the Wobcast 2.0 to talk about all of it. You can find the Wobcast 2.0 wherever you find all of your favorite podcasts, and you can find us early every week. We plan on recording and posting on Mondays as we try and get ahead of all the Vikings news that will be coming down the pike. So with that said, and before we jump into all of the content we have for you today, let's bring in Gyles. How you doing, bud?
Hey, doing as well as can be, considering that we're not continuing our path onto the Super Bowl in 2022. But all that aside, I'm really excited to break down kind of the formula for 2023. What does it take to improve our team? What worked, what didn't in this past season? And how do we improve it? How do we go chase a Super Bowl for next year? And I think, as you can agree, we're all about winning formulas and getting down to the nitty gritty and understanding what specifically went wrong in the season and how do we go fix it. So I think there's a really exciting offseason ahead where we can analyze those things.
I agree with you. Well said there, Gyles. And there's a lot of people in this space who like to speculate, who like to look back and poke holes in what happened. And that's what we want to do too. And we want to do it from the standpoint, a fanatical standpoint, just like a lot of our listeners are, but we also want to do it from a data-driven and an experiential standpoint, which we're uniquely positioned to do with my experience with the team. And Gyles, with your ability to sort of dive into data. And I know a lot of the people listening appreciate that. And we evoke and use emotion from time to time, but we also try and have a steady hand at the wheel as we navigate through this. So coming up on the show today, we're going to drill down on defense. So desired traits and style that we want defensively for the Minnesota Vikings. We'll take a look at some personnel issues that the Vikings are going to have to deal with. And we will take a look at a very key first step that will be dealt with by the Minnesota Vikings as they drill down on defense and try to improve. But first, let's take an overarching view of things, Gyles. And I'll take a swing at that first. I know that we'll dive into data and PFF rankings and some in-the-weeds stats that you may have compiled and prepped for the show. But from a general standpoint, I think, looking at the Vikings defense, you're looking at a unit that was, with due respect to everyone who put a lot of effort into making it good, it was bottom of the barrel defensively for the Vikings when you look at it from a numbers and a production standpoint. 31st in yards allowed, 388.7 yards allowed per game. 31st in pass defense, 265 per game. Middle of the road in run defense. Again, I'm speaking from a production standpoint, middle of the road in run defense, but bottom of the barrel in pass defense. 30th in points, 25.1 per game. So two teams were worse than the Vikings. So again, bottom of the barrel for the Vikings in points per game. They ranked middle of the pack, Gyles, in a lot of things: sacks, turnovers, interceptions, and then really low on a few things. And they were not high in anything. So when you're middle of the road or low average in most things, and then there's a few things where you were 32nd, 31st, or 30th, that's going to the net result there is a pretty low ranking. And that's where the Vikings found themselves. And it reminds me of something we talked about leading up to the Giants playoff game and then after the Giants playoff game, Gyles, where it was like, all right, we had all year to figure something out on defense and to generate some improvement and have an identity, and they just couldn't do it. So now you just got to quickly find something to hang your hat on. What hook is that? And they couldn't even do that, right? I mean, there was nothing unless you're going to come to us here with data that I didn't see coming. If someone asked me in retrospect, well, yeah, they weren't good at this, and that, but they did do that really well. I don't even know what that is. And so I think, let's look at more of the data that you might have. And maybe there is a silver lining or two that you can present with some of the deeper dive numbers. But I think this is a group that is really searching not only just to get better, but also to have an identity. And what is that identity going to be? And I think the only way we can sort of figure out what that should be and have an opinion on that is to take a look back at what happened, what went wrong, and then we can generate some ideas of how to fix it. So for you, Gyles, what went wrong on defense this year?
Yeah, when honestly, before we get into the exact elements, I think it's important to note when things do go wrong, is it because it was a bad idea or we did it wrong? So if you gave up the most yards out of any team in the NFL, was that because we went to the table with the wrong scheme and that's what caused it, or did we operate incorrectly within the scheme? So I think there's some important distinctions there as we parse through some of this stuff. But I think there's also another conversation to be had regarding process and results. If you look back to the 2021 season, according to PFF, which isn't the end-all be-all, but it's a measuring point, we were 21st in total defense. In 2020, we were 27th in total defense, okay? So we went from 27th to 21st in the transition between 2020 and 2021. And then when you transition another year forward, do you know where we ended up PFF-wise in 2022 for total defense?
No, I don't.
We were 4th.
What?
4th. So that tells me when you break down all the different categories, which we'll do here in a second, we were actually pretty good when it came to process of defense. Now, obviously, process doesn't always win games. Results wins games. But it is helpful when analyzing what do we go fix in this offseason? What went wrong? What truly went wrong? You can't say the defense was horrible. Let's just blow it up. Well, Let's get a little more fine-tuned than that. What actually went wrong? When you look at our run defense, in 2021, we were 20th. In 2022, we were 2nd. We were the second best PFF graded team when it came to run defense. So once again, from a process standpoint, we were doing very, very well. When it came to pass rush, in 2021, we were 16th. In 2022, we were 10th. Now, that's not as much as I would prefer, considering that you had Za'Darius Smith and Danielle Hunter, but you were still top 10 in pass rush. We were 4th in tackling. And that's where this next piece really skews up this entire formula, and that's coverage. So when we're taking down what really went wrong, coverage was a very difficult thing in the 2022 season. And that's where we ended the year in the 18th position, which is the exact same as we were in 2021. So when you look at the statistical major categories between run and pass tackling, we were top 2 in most of those, or we were 4th, 2nd, 10th, and 4th. So we were doing pretty well process-wise, and then coverage, things fell apart. Now, obviously, coverage can mean a lot of different things. That's not meant to exclusively pull apart the cornerbacks or the safeties, although that was a very difficult category for the Vikings. We also had some difficulties because we had people playing out of character. Danielle Hunter, for example, backed off into coverage. You had a premier pass rush, hand in the dirt type guy going into a coverage set. So obviously that can have a severe impact. But if you're analyzing what things go wrong, coverage was definitely another big one. So moving on from coverage, another big thing that really hit the Minnesota Vikings in a major way was penalties. Now, it may not necessarily seem at the surface level that we were by far and away a major penalty team, because most people look at penalty more on offense, like, hey, did you move yourself back instead of forward? I think at least a lot of people that I know, they talk about penalty in an offensive standpoint. But defensively, we were 30th in most penalties taken or committed, which then equates to essentially 111 of those committed on our defense, which translates into yards as 926 yards because of penalty. That's that's very unacceptable. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but there was a fairly wide margin between, the top 20 and then the last 30, or last 10 10 teams. So we had a significant number of penalties that moved us back. So when you think about what was causing issue and what was moving the other team forward, it wasn't always our defensive production, it was our mistakes, right? And so that can really have some major impacts. So yeah, so you got definitely penalties, and when you break down, I'm just gonna pull this up.
The other thing too, guys, while
Yeah,
you look for that,
yeah,
with the penalties is a lot of times it's not just the yards that gives up, but it's a fresh set of downs, right?
correct.
And
Yep,
it's a backbreaker. It's almost like I've always thought this about mobile quarterbacks. You get a team in 3rd and 11 or 3rd and 9, and you do everything right, and then the ball is snapped, and you got great coverage and great rush, and you flush them out of the pocket, and then that mobile quarterback runs for a first down.
mm-hmm.
Like that is such a momentum killer. It's a backbreaker. Same thing on a defensive penalty, right?
Yep,
Where you get a pass breakup on a 3rd down, but you get a roughing the passer call, or you get
yep,
a illegal contact.
mm-hmm.
Not only do they get those yards, but they get a fresh set of downs to then get more yards or
Yep,
maybe get points, right?
yep,
So obviously a very key area to clean up. You don't want to be bad at anything, but if you power ranked the things that you could be bad at, like penalties is like you don't want to be bad at penalties. That's really
nope,
what you don't want to be bad at,
that's a killer. Yeah.
So yeah.
Especially when committed on 3rd down, because, like you mentioned, even from a momentum standpoint, you've already endured the physical output to go through at least 3 downs at bare minimum, if not more. And now, unless you commit a turnover or create a turnover, you're going to have to go at least 3 more downs again. So if you're
Yeah.
already exhausted, that can be a real killer to every category when it comes
Yeah.
to your defense on the field. So definitely a difficult element. Now, in terms of kind of a positive thought, that I'd love your thoughts on why this may be, but we were at the 9th least in red zone trips among the NFL when it came to our defensive output. The 9th least. So that meant we were holding teams back from getting into the red zone. More than a lot of
Interesting.
teams in the NFL, which I think is a nod to the team, which is not something I would have considered, considering we gave up a lot of big plays. But it showed that I think we were able to shut down more often than not, more than other teams when it mattered most.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd have to look deeper into that. Also, I want to know, how they calculate that, because I want to make sure that, like, if I'm on my own 40 and I throw a
Mm-hmm.
touchdown pass against you,
Mm-hmm.
60-yard touchdown pass, did I get
Yep.
into the red zone?
Yep.
You know what I mean? Because the
That's a great
Vikings gave
question.
up a lot of points and
Yep.
touchdowns. But that notwithstanding, that is an interesting stat to me, that you could give up so many points and so many yards, but not have faced a lot of red zone possessions. It almost seems like those are juxtaposed.
Mm-hmm.
So that'd be a fun stat to dial into. Also, in you talking about penalties, Gyles, it
Mm-hmm.
makes me want to do a study. I love doing studies,
Mm-hmm.
off-season studies and research, and I would volunteer when I was with the team my time to do that for coaches and for Rick. And they wouldn't always take me up on it, but whenever they did, I would jump right in and do it.
Yeah.
What they did with those, I have no idea. It might have been at the bottom of a wastebasket. It doesn't matter. It was good for my education, and it gave me access to data and film and stuff that helped enhance my mind. But it makes me want to dive deeper into those penalties, Gyles, and see how many scoring drives allowed by the Vikings um, were extended because of penalties. It's like, because if it's 10% or 11% or 12%, something like that, of your scoring drives allowed
Mm-hmm.
were drives that included a penalty that gave the other team a first down. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you got some ground to stand on as the coach, to stand up in front of the room and criticize them for, too many penalties. So it would be interesting for us to do a little deeper dive there.
Yeah, ironically, we were actually 28th in first downs by penalty in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
So we had 22 all season. The number 1 team had 38, and they were the Miami Dolphins,
Oh,
were 38 first downs. Now, obviously, penalties can happen on any down. They're still very, very difficult. Unfortunately, the data I'm looking at doesn't give
yeah.
statistics based on scoring in those drives, but definitely felt like there was some big momentum drivers there. Which kind of translates into another category that I think is important to note, and that is touchdowns versus field goals.
Uh-huh.
We actually were 11th in touchdowns allowed,
So
11th
11th
best.
fewest.
Yeah,
Okay.
11th fewest. Yep. But we were second or I'm sorry, second most in
Field
field goals
goals.
allowed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Second most. So we gave up an unusual amount of field goals, and
Interesting.
that's by a fairly wide margin. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but we gave up a very large number of field goals, which is both a commendation and a
It
difficulty all in
is.
the same well,
It
because it's
is. It
not
is.
getting a touchdown, but
No, you're right, Giles. It is. But I've always something that I've always said, just not necessarily with us on the show, but just when I watch football with people, or I probably say it to myself if I'm watching football alone. But these teams that kick a bunch of field goals on like 4th and 2 and they kick a field goal, it always kills me, especially when they're in like goal to go,
mm-hmm,
and it's like 4th and goal from the 3 and they kick a field goal. Also, when it's 4th and 3 and they try a 55-yard field goal,
mm-hmm,
I'm like, field goals lose games, man. Like,
mm-hmm,
I'm sorry. I know it's great. People say, I just take the points. Just take the points. I get it. You want to take points when they come. That's right. You do, you know, but if you're kicking field goals when you're inside the 10, and if you're trying field goals that are 50 yards or longer when it's 4th and 2 or 3, you're making mistakes.
correct.
And the latter, you're making a judgment mistake, a decision-making mistake. The
Mm-hmm,
former, you're not scoring. You're making physical mistakes by not scoring when you're that close. And so what you said makes sense to me, because we're talking about how poorly the Vikings defense played. However, we all
mm-hmm,
know this is an integrated game, to use a term that you used last week,
mm-hmm,
which I thought was very good. And the Vikings, win-loss wise, had a great season. And
mm-hmm,
it's probably because some teams were kicking field goals instead of scoring
mm-hmm.
touchdowns against them, right?
Yep, yep,
So I think that's a really interesting stat. Second most field goals allowed, Minnesota Vikings. I wouldn't mind that. I don't mind that stat. I think you give up
mm-hmm,
a lot of field goals, you probably win a lot of games, which
yep,
the Vikings did. So
yep.
reminds me of another stat, Gyles, that I saw on social media this weekend. Since 2021, so 2 full seasons now, no
Okay.
team has missed a PAT against the Vikings.
Interesting. What do you
And I'm
take
like,
away from that?
I don't take much away from it other than bad luck.
Okay, yeah. Because
I
there's
mean,
not a ton you can do to affect the kicker. I mean, you can try to throw some mental edge against them, but it's not always
no, I
100%
think
effective.
it's just bad luck. And I'm like, geez,
Yeah.
the Vikings. I feel like Vikings fans can't even look at PATs. They like
Yeah.
when Greg Joseph is out there, my wife turns away.
Yeah.
Like she can't watch. I'm like,
Yep. Here
oh
goes the game again.
yeah, and it's like these
Yeah.
other teams make them like their layups.
Yeah. Yep.
Anyway,
And I think that,
I
yeah.
digress. But
And I think that also goes into another stat. We are eighth in most drives per game. So we
okay.
allow more drives per game than any other team except for seven others.
So you face the most possessions, you're saying? The
Correct.
Vikings face. Okay.
Yep. And I think statistically, even if you're the 49ers who have a fantastic defense, the more often you're on the field, the worse it's going to get, period. Because I think exertion affects defenses a lot more than offenses. Maybe you would
Yeah.
disagree, but
No, I
there's a
agree.
lot more pressure on the defense than there is in the offense. So the more you're on the field, the worse it's going to get. So I think if you're looking to go fix anything on the 2023 game plan, it might be getting the offense to stay on the field a little bit more. And I thought we did fine from an offensive standpoint, but I think from what that is saying, we either turned the ball over too much or we scored too quickly. Where we did have pretty fast drives on offense. I think we are actually 28th in drive length, or average time per drive. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Interesting. Well, I think if you're scoring too quickly, that is not the issue,
Okay.
because I understand it's like you're making the defense go back out onto the field and they're going to get tired the more often they're out there. I agree with all that. But if you're
Yep.
backing that up with points, I think by definition, you're also cutting them a break, because if you're continuously scoring on offense or scoring too quickly, you're putting pressure on the other offense. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times when you're putting pressure on them to score, you're forcing them to be more predictable or more one-dimensional, which makes it easier on your defense. I think the
Yeah.
problem is if you're going 3 and out a bunch of times,
Yeah.
or
That's
if
very true.
that is where it's taxing on the defense.
Yep.
And then sort of a related point, is it is, and I think that I don't want to I don't want to single out the Tennessee Titans because it might be a little unfair to them, but they are the type of offense to me that is trying to be methodical and run the ball and chew clock and all of that. And the only issue with that type of philosophy is the more plays it takes you to score, the more chances you are taking, or the more risk you're incurring on injury,
Mm-hmm.
penalty, turnover, something bad happening. You know
Yep.
what I mean? So I think you want to have a balance there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's kind of weird to be like, oh, we scored too quickly there. Like,
Yeah.
but I do hear what you're saying. I mean,
Yep.
your defense needs some time to rest.
Yep.
So
And I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think the stats may prove this out. Where I think there were a lot of scenarios where either the Vikings scored, they had a scoring drive, or they went on a 3-and-out. There weren't
yeah,
very many drives from the eye test that resulted in something other than that. We didn't have very many drives that were 8 plays deep, and then we went to a third down and had to punt it away. If we could get the ball moving, we scored almost always, but there were a significant number of 3-and-outs as well. So I think you're hitting on something there.
yeah, yep. Okay, interesting. What else on defense that stood out to you?
When it came to, I'm just pulling this up here. When it came to the number of drives ending in score, specifically on the defense, we ended 28th. So we were essentially 41% of our defensive drives ended in a score for them, for the opposing offense. The
Yeah.
number one place was the 49ers, and they had 25% of their drives ended in a score. So there's a pretty big margin there in terms of drives that ended in a score. Now, wasn't able to do this analysis, but I think, once again, that may have resulted in a field goal, but it was still points on the board, and that was a very difficult thing. Now, I could go through a lot of different categories. For example, we were 11th in interceptions, so we were able to stay in some games due to interception on defense. I think that covered up a lot of inefficiencies. But when you're zooming out from a 3,000-foot view, when you looked at the touchdowns by rushing versus receiving, rushing was middle of the pack. Receiving, we did really, really bad. I think when you explore this offseason, we need to figure out a way to improve our coverage. And that, I think, ends up in the middle part of the field as well as the secondary. Our linebacker room was simply not fast enough to be able to tackle some things. We did serviceable in the run game. I think the 3-4 defense has an extra big body in the middle, so we were able to shore up our defense in contrast to where it was last year. But I think regardless of how we go tackle that, that is an objective for this offseason. How do we shore up our secondary? Because the game is a game of integration, like we mentioned before, and I think that had a tremendous impact on our pass rush as well.
Yeah.
Where if you watched a lot of snaps, Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith were getting home a lot. They were just getting home too late. Where the play didn't have enough time to develop, where the ball was already in the hands of the receiver, either literally or figuratively, by the time we got home. And I think that's more of an indictment on the secondary. So that can be player, that can be scheme, but that's definitely something to go fix.
Well, Gyles and I are not lockstep in all things Vikings. There are many things that we will be, and there will be some things that we aren't. In this one, though, Gyles, defensively, we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that it'll probably be a theme for the Wobcast 2.0 this offseason, talking about coverage.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I just if it's just like you gave me license to point a finger at a component of the defense that needs to get better blindly without digging into the data as you did, just going off the eye test and watching games back and a little bit of tape here and there, I would have said coverage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that late in the season, when the Vikings were giving up chunk plays to the Jets and to the Giants and to Mac Jones and the Patriots, that was an indictment on the coverage. And whether you want to blame scheme and ideas or whether you want to blame players and ability, whatever, but it's got to get better. And
Has to.
I don't ever remember a show of ours or a conversation at the supermarket or a stream of consciousness from myself in the shower where I'm lamenting the run defense or I'm lamenting the tackling or I'm, lamenting much of anything other than coverage. I'm like, it's too easy. It's too easy to throw against this defense. So I have a feeling that we're going to talk a lot about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was always told, and I know I'm not the only one who's heard this, but pass defense is a mix of rush and coverage. So
Mm-hmm.
we can't only blame the corners and the safeties, which I know you've stated already in this show, but I think that's a good place to start when you want to look at personnel to improve.
Mm-hmm.
I think you should start there. And that improvement does not have to be new players, Gyles. That improvement can be development of current players, right?
Yep.
I think we've seen tremendous growth and a big surprise from a guy like Duke Shelley,
Mm-hmm.
and
Phenomenal.
I'm very curious to see if that staff can do what they did with Duke Shelley. I wonder what they can do with the Caleb Evans,
Mm-hmm. Andrew
who
Booth Jr.
and Andrew Booth Jr., who you could fairly state may have more talent than Duke Shelley because of where they were drafted. Doesn't always mean you're going to be a better player, but it's safe to say you probably, from a measurable standpoint, have more talent because
Mm-hmm.
you got drafted higher. So I'll be curious to see what this staff can do with those two corners in particular. I believe the ship has sort of sailed, or at least we know what he is when it comes to Cam Dantzler, but maybe I'm
Mm-hmm.
wrong. Maybe you can get more out of him. But absolutely a Caleb Evans, absolutely Andrew Booth, and absolutely Duke Shelley are three players that you can develop. So it's not all about drafting and free agents. It's about developing players. But to sort of put a bow on this segment of episode 1 of season 2 here, drilling down on defense, we want the coverage to get better, and it needs to get better if the Vikings defense is going to play better.
Agreed.
All right. Well, let's move on. I mentioned that in this episode we would talk about something that we already know is defined, and that is the first step to fixing the defense. We already know what that is. That is hiring a new defensive coordinator, because the Vikings have moved on from Ed Donatel. So there is an opening. I do not get a sense, Gyles, that opening will be filled from within. And so, there are assistant coaches on the staff. There's Mike Pettin. I don't get a strong sense that that's what's happening. I do get a strong sense it's a guy coming from outside the building.
Agreed.
Do you disagree with that?
I think if they were going to go internal, they would have already announced it by then.
All right.
Especially from a cultural standpoint, they wouldn't want to be perceived as, oh, we're going to check out other players. We didn't like them. We're going to go with you. People internally would feel like an afterthought. And whether you like it or not, emotions play into people's performance, period. And they seem like too much of a culture-focused organization to try to do that to someone. So I think it's almost exclusively an outside hire.
All right. So with that being said, let's blend what you and I think would be best for the team with what we know Vikings Nation wants.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm hearing and seeing from Purple Nation is they were not happy with play calling on defense. They want more aggressiveness, which is no surprise. Have you ever heard a fellow fan say they want more passivity? No, they never want more, right? So they want more aggressiveness. Now that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And, I got into a fun Twitter discussion over the weekend where it's like, you don't have to call blitzes all the time to get pressure on the quarterback. You have to rush better. You can get there with 4 guys. There are teams who are really good at sacking the quarterback who do not blitz a lot. In fact, the 09 Vikings with Leslie Frazier as the coordinator got to the passer quite a bit. They did not blitz very often. They played Tampa 2 and they rushed with 4 down linemen, and that was pretty much it. Rush 4, drop 7, and got him to the NFC title game. So
it's a dangerous combination, actually, if you can do it that way.
If you can get there. Yeah, you're right. So they want more aggressiveness. They want more blitzing. They want more pass pressure. And so I think that is if the fans perceive that the person the Vikings hire is going to be more aggressive and blitz a lot, they're going to be happy. And this is so ironic to me, Gyles, because this is the same subset of people who didn't want Mike Zimmer around anymore. This is what he does.
Yep.
Okay. So anyway,
ultimately the master at it.
Right. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, or is it?
Yeah.
We might have a suggestion about that later on here in this discussion. But all right, there have been some names bandied about, Gyles, for defensive coordinators. Let's go over them. Okay. Yeah. I think the one that if you did a fan poll, the guy who would win is Brian Flores.
Yeah. Solid choice.
Okay.
I think he was honestly an amazing head coach, even better defensive coordinator. Obviously had some political issues when he was in Miami, but all politics aside, phenomenal coach.
All right. So You're right. Background. He would be one who would come from the Bill Belichick coaching tree. He coached with
Mm-hmm.
Belichick in New England, and in fact, Vikings head coach Kevin O'Connell and Flores were both in New England with Belichick at the same time. O'Connell as a player, Flores
Mm-hmm.
as a coach, assistant coach. So Flores goes on to be the Dolphins head coach. There is some controversy and acrimony there. He ends up no longer being in Miami. Mike McDaniel is there, and Flores lands with the Steelers, where I
Mm-hmm.
believe he coached linebackers and was
Yeah.
an assistant head coach to Mike Tomlin. So
Yes.
I think with Flores, you would have sort of an attitude, a swagger, a vibe that players, I think it would fit very well with players and fans
Mm-hmm.
would love. That's what I think you have with him. You also, I believe, would have a guy who would run a 3-4 defense. That's his background anyway. So I
Mm-hmm.
just presume he would do that here.
Yep.
Um, so I think that's definitely a name to watch. Do you have any additional thoughts on Flores? Would you, for any reason, would you scratch a line through his name, or would you entertain that option?
I think you absolutely entertain it because at the end of the day, the main objective is improving your defense. Obviously, you can wordsmith what needs to be improved among the defense, which we happen to think is your coverage and your secondary. But the point is the primary objective is to improve the defense, and Brian Flores has proved time in and time out that he's an amazing defensive mind. I
Okay.
do want to call out both on the field and off the field. Off the field, I do think he is quite the opposite of Ed Donatel, and maybe that is one of the reasonings of bringing him in. Ed Donatel was a very culture-driven guy. Obviously, one of the reasons that he was hired. Pretty much everyone you talk to calls him an amazing guy. He's an amazing guy on and off the field. He
Yeah.
had some issues with performance, obviously, but a really, really nice guy. And I think a lot of descriptors among Brian Flores as he's a very hard-nosed type person. So you're going to get a much different style when it comes to defense. Now, to
Interesting.
be
Yeah.
explicitly clear, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the way you're going to coach offense may be different than the way you coach defense, but you are getting a very different person when it comes to defense. So something to be called out. And I
Okay.
think when it comes to on the field, correct me if you would disagree. I think in the kind of base defense that Brian Flores likes to run, although it is a 3-4 defense, he's a lot more man than he is zone. So it would be a little bit of a fundamental shift away from the Ed Donatel and Vic Fangio style defense, which then kind of equates to how you go attack the offseason. If you're planning to run more man zone or man coverage in contrast to zone, that does kind of factor into the type of guys you need to have and the way that you build your offseason protocol.
Agreed. I would guess, based on background only, that the way you described Flores is correct. A lot of man, less zone, definitely 3-4. But again, we won't know that until we see it, right?
Yep.
And that's something
Yep.
that Kevin O'Connell and Quezzy have to figure out and decide what they want for a style, and and then decide if Flores can deliver that. Let
Yep.
me ask you
One,
this though. Oh no,
Oh yeah, go ahead. I
No,
was
no,
going to say one additional thing. I have heard Brian Flores described as the ultimate teacher, which I think is a phenomenal thing, especially for this group, because I think there was definitely a huge chunk of our failures, so to speak, or areas where we didn't necessarily succeed that were driven by the lack of experience. Where we had a big portion of our defense that was used to running a 4-3, used to running man coverage, and then they were asked to do something entirely different. And I think you could make a large argument that they were simply not prepared. So I think having a phenomenal teaching presence in the room, if you're going to stick with a 3-4 defense and run a man zone, could be a very valuable thing come 2023.
All right, interesting. Last thing on Flores before we move on to the other candidates. Would it bother you? He's reportedly interviewing to be head coach of the Cardinals, and he's been a head coach before. So would it bother you? Would it factor into your decision at all to know that likely that the best case scenario is that he comes in and generates great improvement for you?
Mm-hmm.
If that happens, which is great, he would be gone after 1 year. He'd be a head coach next year probably. So does that factor in for you? Like, does that bug you at all that it's probably a 1 year hire?
I would say philosophically, it definitely bothers me, but I think that's a reality of being a good team. If you have any success in any category, they're going to get stolen away more than likely the next offseason. We already have a pretty large percentage of our offensive staff that are being tapped to come interview in other places around the NFL. So it's simply a reality. If we're going to improve our team, you're going to lose coaches, period.
All right, great. Let's go to the next candidate, and that is Sean Desai, who's got a background with the Seahawks. And if that's all you look at, you would see a 4-3 front, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's largely what Seattle runs. However, I think Pete Carroll is very similar to Bill Belichick in that if you just simply looked at how many down linemen do they have, like Carroll is a 4-3 guy and Belichick's
Mm-hmm.
a 3-4 guy. But if you talk to anyone who's worked with those guys, coached under them, played for them, they would tell you, yeah, but with Belichick, we had a lot of 4-3 principles. And with
Mm-hmm.
Carroll, we had a lot of 3-4 principles. So I think Desai would have that ability to blend the concepts a
Yep.
little bit. And I think that would be good for the Vikings, whose roster is in transition between these two schemes. So, any
Yep.
thoughts on Desai?
Yeah, that's honestly one of the number one reasons that I think he'd be the best candidate for the job, because he's a huge culture guy, but not a soft type of culture, a guy where he can't issue bad news necessarily,
Yeah.
but seeming like he'd be a great fit from a cultural standpoint. But more importantly, exactly like you mentioned, he understands both 3-4 and 4-3, and I think could blend that very well, because that is something that does get overanalyzed in the NFL. You're either a 4-3 or you're a 3-4. Well, really, you run everything in pretty much every game. It's just a matter of what percentages are going to go where. You might be in a base defense 20% of the time, which if that's a 3-4 defense, you're in 3-4 formation 20% of the time. Well, there's still 80% of the time when you're not there. It's just a matter of how does that match up against the other team's base offense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seeing what those matchups look like. So the point is you need to be able to manage both of those, because there's downs where you're going to be in a 4-3 formation, period. So being able to manage those effectively is very, very important. But furthermore, he is a defensive backs guy.
Uh-huh.
And, I don't want to necessarily be the guy that makes a major knee-jerk reaction, but coverage in secondary is where we are hurting the most. So I think it makes some logical sense to bring in a defensive backs guy to help bring that to life, because it does depend on how we tackle our personnel in the offseason. But let's go down the route of us trying to keep as many of the existing front seven personnel as possible, or at least our front four, including our edge rushers. They're phenomenal players, or at least above average in most categories. Dalvin Tomlinson, good to great player. Harrison Phillips, good to great player.
Yep.
Same thing with Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith, where I think if you're going to bring a focused person, I think part of it needs to be developing that secondary. So that's where Desai would be coming in a very valuable category.
Okay. Good breakdown there. Agreed with all of that. Let's look at a similar candidate in terms of profile and career arc, but a different candidate in terms of background specialty, and that is Ryan Nielsen of the Saints, who's got more of a background with defensive linemen. So the advantages that you just stated about Desai and the back end of the defense are not there. However, it's flipped with having an advantage with some of the guys up front and Ryan Nielsen and the experience of a Saints defense that has been very stout over the past 5 or so seasons, right?
Yep.
And particularly their defensive line has been good. And the development of Cam Jordan in New Orleans, I think Ryan Nielsen clearly had a hand in that. So player development with defensive linemen, I think you'd be in good hands with a guy like Ryan Nielsen, someone who's not been a coordinator before. And again, same sort of point in the career arc as Sean Desai. So you just stated what you like about Desai, which would lead me to believe that you may not necessarily prefer Nielsen, but your take on Nielsen as a candidate.
Yeah, I think he'd be a good cultural fit. I think there's obviously different ways to crack an egg. If you're really trying to generate pressure and prevent passing downs, either you really have a stout secondary or have a stout pass rush to help the other one out, right? So I think this could potentially be a category if you're able to maintain Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith on your team to build a good enough pass rush where it covers up more of your secondary. So although it wouldn't necessarily be the route that I would take to fix things, I think there could be a route where if you're going to emphasize the line, that you could still have good results. But I think there is another conversation buried beneath this, and that is our edge rushing group. Although Danielle Hunter and Zadarius Smith all graded out above an 80 in PFF, every other edge rusher that we had performed actually pretty poorly. Patrick Jones II did not have a pretty good season, although he had some flashes. He ended the year at a 62.5 grade. DJ Wanham, even worse, he ended the season at a 58.0. Luigi Villan was below a 60 as well. So we have some issues when it comes to the edge rusher group if you take away our 2 stars. So I think if one of those 2, if not both, have to leave the team for whatever reason, you might have an edge rusher problem. So I think there's a chance that maybe that'd be a valuable thing if the team is looking on beyond this year.
Interesting. Well, I think those are the top 3 candidates for now anyway, Gyles, Flores, Desai, and Nielsen, but there are others to consider. The Denver Broncos are an interesting one to me because I think their defense was pretty dang good last year, but they have a change at head coach. And so you never know what's going to happen. You might have very good, solid coaches who are not asked to come back because you got a new head coach coming in. However, that organization may decide, hey, even though this isn't one of your guys, he's a young rising star coach, so we're going to keep him. Escher Evero is an example of that. He was the Broncos defensive coordinator this past season, but we don't know if he's going to be back or not. Now, it will not surprise me if the Broncos keep him. However, if someone comes in there, like say a Sean Payton comes in there and he's already got his staff figured out, let's say, a guy like that could be on the street and could be available. Joe Witt Jr., Vic Fangio, Raheem Morris, Lovie Smith, examples of coaches with some track record on the defensive side of the football who could be considered. And then another example of a young coach without much of a track record or experience being a coordinator who I've heard mentioned, not specifically to the Vikings, but in general, is Jared Mayo, who used to play for the Patriots, but now coaches for the Patriots. So some more names to bandy about there. Have not heard a lot of Vikings fans mention those individuals. But I think those are all sort of like second tier or, second tier conversation pieces to this job behind Flores, Desai, and Nielsen. Any other names that you want to throw into the ring?
So I have a couple thoughts, and I'm going to talk about the first one related to the Broncos because there's a tremendous amount of steam about Sean Payton taking over as head coach.
Yes.
Well, before that steam, there was other steam, and that was the fact that he had already put together his coaching staff. Like it was already prepped and ready to go. It was ready to be plugged and played. And the going away favorite was Vic Fangio as his defensive coordinator. Well, that brings a potentially interesting scenario considering that Vic Fangio was the head coach last year, or in 2021, and so that would be him coming back to his former team as a defensive coordinator. Now Vic Fangio is a phenomenal defensive mind, and supposedly was already picked by Sean Payton. So you have an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. What happens there?
Wow! So the team fires the guy from being its head coach, hires a head coach that doesn't go over very well, and their next head coach has the old head coach on his staff and comes back to the team. Wow.
Yeah. Which translates directly into my next hottest take.
Oh boy.
I think in 2022 or 2023 rather, the Minnesota Vikings should bring back Mike Zimmer.
Oh my.
I mean, tell me I'm wrong here. Let's break this down logically. I know that sounds a little bit outlandish because it was a very tenuous departure. But if you analyze all the available people in the open market that are great at defense, he has to be towards the top of the list.
Well, yeah, right. Yes, he is. So, yeah, if you go blind resume, right?
Yeah.
No face or name on the resume and just credentials.
Yep.
Yeah, you should hire Mike Zimmer. Duh.
He's a defensive backs coach that is amazing at blitzes. I mean, he is one of the best minds over the last 25 years at exotic blitzes.
Oh, my God.
And you can make an argument that before the last 2 to 3 years of his tenure as Vikings head coach, when he was able to truly focus on the defense, we had some of the best defenses, not only in the given year that they were playing, but in NFL history. The double A gap blitz was phenomenal. He was still able to coach the corners. Obviously, there were some distractions later on in his tenure that I thought took his attention off of the defense. But if you're looking at the best defensive minds to plug and play, Zimmer is one of the top, in my opinion.
I think I would pay a mortgage payment to be on the a fly on the wall or to have my ear to the phone for that conversation. Whoever at the Minnesota Vikings would have to pick up the phone to make that call. I would give a mortgage payment to hear
Seriously.
to hear Zimmer's response to that. That is phenomenal. But
What?
so
Yeah.
I I mean, honestly, I don't think it's realistic. Like, I
Let's
really
go down to
don't.
his ranch and ask him.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, I know a
Trip.
guy who would know how to get there. So, um, however, like, however realistic I think it is, Gyles, I do think that that take is rooted in logic and is well intentioned. I mean, because you're right. Like, what you want them to be good at, the Vikings defense to get good at again, he can do that.
Yep.
You know,
He's able to truly focus on it.
and isn't it fair to say that the only reason Zimmer is no longer head coach of the Vikings? Well, isn't it fair to say that there is not one reason he's no longer head coach of the Vikings? I mean, it's a cocktail of problems that lead to a coach being asked to leave, right?
Correct.
It's
Yep.
not just because he forgot to coach defense or the defense played poorly. I mean,
Correct.
there's a lot of things going on there. There's acrimony with the quarterback, perhaps.
Yep.
There
Yep.
were maybe disagreements about where to allocate salary cap or cash
Yep.
on the roster. Like, there's just a lot of different things going on, right?
Yep.
So
I think through the first couple seasons, he was able to truly focus on defense because he found offensive minds to be able to effectively run the offense, which is something a proper head coach is able to do. Really, finding those right people. And then the moment Kirk Cousins came in, I think our offense started to decline. Obviously, our cap scenario was a lot different than the years before. So I think he was required to take his attention off of defense and try to help out with the offense, an area that wasn't necessarily his forte. But I think that was really the moment where our defense started to decline when he took his true focus off of it. So if you don't put offense on his plates and have him focus on defense, I really think you're able to get a phenomenal result. And he already knows the existing players and understands their strengths and weaknesses. So I think there could be a true amazing category there. But you might be right. It's not plausible.
Well, I really don't think it's plausible at all, but I do appreciate the thought. And I honestly think if you, like I said, if you did blind resume, I mean, he would be up there with Flores as like co-favorite, or there'd be like two different camps and they both have compelling arguments and you just got to choose which one you prefer. It'd be Flores and Zimmer. I mean, it's a great way to look at it. And I think it'd be awesome to see it.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're going to see it.
Yeah. Which then goes into my next candidate. I think this arguably may be my favorite, although he's not necessarily being formally considered right now.
Really? So hold on. So there's a candidate that we haven't spoke of yet that you maybe like the most?
That's not being formally considered. You did mention him earlier, though.
Oh, okay. Who is it?
And that is Raheem Morris.
Okay.
So a buddy of mine in high school ended up going into the Navy SEALs. And one of their big shticks is that they're big on trust. Like, trust is paramount. If you had to line up the best Navy SEAL on the planet that you maybe don't necessarily fully trust, not saying you don't trust him, but there's not the trust built. And then someone that is middle of the road capable, but you trust inherently, they'll always take the one with the most trust. And that's where I think Kevin O'Connell and Raheem Morris, from what I've heard, have a very great rapport together. And that's also not to say that Raheem Morris is a bad coach. I think he's a phenomenal coach. So when you pair that great chemistry between Kevin O'Connell and Raheem Morris and a great pedigree when it comes to defense, that's where I think that's what I want to throw my chips onto. If you want to improve the defense, you need to be able to have candid conversations between the offensive coach and the defensive coach. And I think you're going to get the best output with those two, period.
All right. So honestly, I mean, Zimmer is my favorite candidate that you've talked about. I am very interested in the Raheem Morris idea, Gyles. For a lot of the reasons you just mentioned. He's got a defensive background. However, he has also coached wide receivers. He's definitely a defensive guy, but he's coached wide receivers. He's also been a head coach before. So I think there's a really great advantage to having a former head coach on your staff in a coordinator position, because it doesn't allow you to be lazy and ignore that side of the ball, but it's like trust is really important, as you just talked about. And I think you're more likely to trust that person.
Mm-hmm.
So, really interesting idea. Probably the idea I like the most. If I had to, I don't know. I think Raheem Morris and Brian Flores are like equal candidates in my mind in terms
Yep.
of like quality outcome. And you got this guy or that guy. I'd feel like equally the same about both.
Yep.
I'm more intrigued with Morris from a cultural camaraderie, just vibe standpoint. I'm more interested in that than I am in Flores. I truly think Brian Flores is a 1 year hire.
Yeah. Agreed.
I even if it's like you're middle of the road on defense next year, I think he's going to be a candidate to be a head coach next year.
Yep.
And
Agreed.
I'm not saying that Raheem Morris won't be. I'm just saying it's far less likely that he would be.
Yeah.
I'm sure Raheem wants to be a coach again, a head coach again, and he very well may get there. But I think Flores is getting there first. So I'm more interested in the Raheem Morris one. And then a caveat with Raheem Morris that, take this for what it's worth. The Vikings in 2012 coached the Senior Bowl. They were the North Squad coaches of the Senior Bowl. And that same year, the Washington Redskins, who are now the Commanders, but then they were the Redskins, were coaching the South team.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it was Mike Shanahan who was the head coach of the Redskins at that time, because his son Kyle was definitely the offensive coordinator, and Raheem Morris was on that staff as well. So I spent the week in Mobile, Alabama at the Senior Bowl, which I ordinarily would have done in my role with the Vikings, covering the team for Vikings.com.
Yep.
But specifically that year, I had an elevated role because our director of public relations at the time, Bob Hagan, who is still with the Vikings and is one of my dear friends, works the Super Bowl for the NFL every year. And so the Senior Bowl is happening at the same time that prep for the Super Bowl has ensued. So he had to be at the Super Bowl. So I fulfilled some of Bob's duties down in Mobile as the pseudo PR guy, in addition to my content roles for Leslie Frazier, who was coaching the Senior Bowl because he was the Vikings head coach at the time. So long story shorter, I got to interact and I got to know both Raheem Morris and Kyle Shanahan quite well, just from being in meetings with them, from being in sideline conversations with them, talking about logistics and weather and practice and what are we going to press releases and what are we going to tell reporters and what time's a press conference. And then from a social standpoint of going out for a beverage after the work is done, or going to a community event or whatever. So anyway, both of those guys are great guys, and they were very enjoyable to be around. And Raheem Morris has great, he's just got charisma. I think he's got leadership traits. I think he's got charisma. I don't think he takes himself too seriously. And I think he's got the ability to get along with someone, even if he doesn't have a level of expertise in their area. He can get along with that guy. He can get along with the offensive lineman. He can get along with the punter. He can get along with the equipment guy, even though he's the offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator. So I'm very intrigued by the Raheem Morris idea.
Well, and apparently a lot of the Los Angeles Rams coaching staff were given permission to seek jobs elsewhere. Now, I don't know if that was in preparation for the retirement of the head coach and now that's been withdrawn, but if that is true, Raheem Morris is at the top of my list. If he is releasable, he's the guy to go after. So I think that'd be the only reason that he wouldn't come over to the Vikings, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly, is that he doesn't have permission to come over here.
Okay. Interesting. Well, I'd love to see that. It would be interesting to see how that unfolds. Now, we'll be back next Monday with another episode of the Wobcast, and the Vikings may have a defensive coordinator hired by that point, and it'd be fun to talk about it. If not, we'll continue this speculation on who the defensive coordinator will be, because we have identified it as the most important step right now to fixing the Vikings defense. Is you got to figure out who the boss is, what the scheme is, and what the style is, and then you got to go get players who can fit that, and then you got to develop your current players into the roles that are needed in that style and that scheme. So will be very interesting to see what happens. Those are our opinions on who they should be. and there are other topics to move on here to discuss about the Vikings defense. Any last items though on the coordinator, Gyles?
No, hopefully we can get the best guy available and continue the chase for the championship next year.
I hope so too. All right, so um, whoever that person is, though, we will then know if it's a 4-3 or a 3-4, and then we will know what to do on the personnel side of things. I think any sort of discussion about what to do with individuals that we're going to talk about right here in the next segment it's predicated on who's the coordinator. So, with that being said, let's have a brief discussion about some of these players and what the Vikings should do with them. From a PFF grades, individual performance standpoint, Gyles, is there anything that's obvious to you with Harrison Smith or Patrick Peterson or Eric Kendricks or Danielle Hunter or Zadarius Smith that needs to happen? I want to come at it from that standpoint, because if we can just get out of the way the things that, regardless of who the coordinator is, we know this is what they should do with this person. Let's put that one behind us. So is there anything that sticks out to you in that way?
Yeah, I think two really big ones. The first, in the safety position, although I love Harrison Smith, he's a Ring of Honor definite in the Minnesota Vikings. I think he's all but had his last snap as a Viking. He has a tremendously high cap hit next year. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe that a lot of it is cuttable if we're able to either trade or cut him. And he had a pretty substantial decline in performance in this past year, where he wasn't the player he once was. He's a phenomenal Hall of Fame level player in his heyday, but every player declines eventually, and he has reached that point. But more importantly, Josh Metellus specifically has risen up in phenomenal ways. He ended the season with an 85.1 PFF grade, with just about 300 snaps. So it's not like he played twice. He played a fair amount of snaps and played at a very high level for all of them. So I'm an advocate for replacing Josh Metellus into the Harrison Smith role immediately. And once again, I'd say this to his face if he was standing in front of me: all due respect to everything you've done for this team, you've been a phenomenal player, but the time has come for us to switch those things out. If you're looking at it logically, Josh Metellus has earned himself a starting role, and Harrison Smith has played his way out of one. So I think immediately, let's cheapen the position and let's get better at the position, all in the same move, and let's put Josh Metellus into the starting role.
All right. So you have a Gyles, I'll step in here quickly before you move on to the next one, because you said there were two, right? And this was your first one. So yeah, it's a cap hit of close to 20 million.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a big one.
So you can't do that. No. So what you're looking at here is a contract extension that had been done a couple of times, and you kick the can down the road and push cap hits to future years, right? So you cut them, and it's dead cap of 11.7 million. So I guess it comes down to, if you want him from an ability, skill, and leadership standpoint, can you get him to take a pay cut close to 12 million? That's what you have to do. If you're wishy-washy on ability, skill, and even wanting him, then it's absolutely, you're moving on from him, and you're cutting him, or you're finding a way to, you're still gonna take a hit. But at some point you got to do that with a guy like Harrison Smith, who's, a franchise guy, and you're going to keep paying him and do right by him. At some point you got to take a hit to get out of it. So,
maybe you could trade him. Trade him to a different scheme and try to say he had a down year. Because, I mean, maybe I oversold it, but he did end the year at a 69.1, which for Harrison Smith is a huge decline, but is still slightly above average as a safety. Now it's a lot for a $22 million safety, but maybe you could try to convince some team that is safety desperate to take him and take on that cap hit. But that could be one of the angles to try to adjust that room. But if you can get him to take a pay cut, he's definitely a homer guy. I mean, you know him a lot better than I do. So if you know that, hey, that's not him, that's not a route, say so. But maybe you could say, hey, if you want to retire as a Viking, we need you to take a pay cut.
Yeah. Well, from what I can see, Gyles, you can release him and designate it a post June 1st, and then it's a 4 million dead cap hit this year, but it's an 8 million dead cap hit next year. So same thing with trading him, basically. And again, we're delving into some we're navigating some waters here that you kind of have to be an expert to talk about it with much detail and
Yeah.
accuracy. So
Yeah.
we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But suffice it to say, you're talking about a great player historically,
Mm-hmm.
currently a great guy and a great leader
Mm-hmm.
who is naturally declining with time and age and is very expensive, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So it is a tough decision emotionally, but logically, it kind of feels to us like it's a clear cut decision, and we will see what the team does. Is that
Yep.
fairly stated?
Fairly stated. And the
Okay.
last thing on that point, when it comes to fixing the defense and more importantly, fixing the secondary, one of the big things that I've seen that has relayed to our defensive difficulties is speed. Harrison Smith used to be a real fast guy, and he has declined significantly in that category. So if you can upgrade in speed, I think you automatically upgrade in defensive performance. Even if their performance is middle of the road, simply being faster, not even to do with anything with their performance, but simply being faster will do a lot better for our defensive output. So that's where I'm really excited to see Lewis Cine come back on the field. I mean, he only got 2 snaps the entire season, so it's impossible to say whether he's good, bad, or indifferent. But if he can be what he was when he was at Georgia, which was a more of a 4-3 type defense, I'm really excited to see that because I believe, correct me if I'm misremembering, but out of the first 10 yards of the 40-meter dash for his combine, he was the fastest in history. Like
I
in
remember
the
you
first 10
saying that.
yards, he was
Yeah.
phenomenal. So
Yeah.
Lewis Cine is definitely someone you want to keep an eye on. If you compare him with Josh Metellus, if Lewis Cine can come on the field and be phenomenal day one in his second year, there's a chance that we could have a top 10 or a top 5 safety unit considering how well Josh Metellus has played.
Okay. I have stated before on the Wobcast 2.0, I'm a big Josh Metellus guy myself. So I don't think he's currently even close to as good as Harrison Smith. And I don't know if he'll ever be that good, but that's a high bar to achieve anyway. So I think if you're 80% as good as Harrison Smith for 6 or 7 years, you're a great player. So that room has the potential to be very young and very fast. There will be growing pains with that combination of things. If you can absorb those growing pains, get around them, coach them up, I think you will have benefited from going that direction.
Agreed.
So we will see what happens. Okay, you said there were 2. Harrison Smith was the first. What's the second?
Eric Kendricks, another guy I would put in the same category as Harrison Smith, a homer guy, phenomenal guy on and off the field, has done amazing things in purple, but unfortunately he's experiencing the same issues. He's gotten old and he's gotten slow. Very intelligent player, but simply his body is not keeping up with his mind. And this is another one of those scenarios where I'm not just trying to call out a problem. I also want to bring a solution, and that is Brian Asamoah. Thankfully, we're able to draft very, very well in that category. Brian Asamoah ended the year at a 78.8 PFF grade, and he played, almost 150 snaps. So not a ton, but also not nothing either, and played pretty well in most of those categories. And he's another character that is very fast, an element that we definitely need in our middle linebacker room. When you contrast the above average, if not better, performance with Brian Asamoah and the declining nature of Eric Kendricks is also a massive cap hit next year. So the idea is let's get better and let's get cheaper all in the same motion. Whether you're talking about the safety position or the middle linebacker room, we need to experience both of those considering the other things that are happening on this team.
11.4 million cap hit in 2023, Gyles. And from what I'm reading, it's not a huge, there's not a lot of dead cap if you waive them. So, seems very likely that this is something the Vikings are strongly going to consider here in the offseason for all the reasons you mentioned, on top of some others based on who the new coordinator is. New coordinator comes in and doesn't stand on the table for him, increases the chances that he would be out. He's 31 years old already. The 2023 season will be his 31-year-old season. So he's not a spring chicken young pup anymore. I still think he's got a place in the league for someone. I just don't know that the Vikings the Vikings defense's profile, I don't know, should include someone like Eric Kendricks right now, from just where he's at in his career arc and how much it costs to keep a player of his caliber and accomplishment. I just don't know if the Vikings should include him. I'm
Yep.
kind of siding with you on that. And I was very discouraged about his performance and the way he looked late in the season. And I thought the playoff game against the Giants only exacerbated that
Yep.
very obvious
Yep.
reality to me.
Yep.
I mean, the Giants are a very horizontal offense, and he really had a hard time getting to the right spot. He knew where to go. He just had a hard time getting there in time.
Yep. And honestly, another kind of overarching conversation that's going to occur over this entire offseason is the balance of both cap hit and performance. And although both are very, very important, I want to make sure I'm being clear on my position. I will always value performance first. Just because I can lower a cap hit somewhere doesn't mean I'm willing to get worse. If you have a high performing player with a high cap hit, I'd much rather have that than the other way around. So the fact that they're declining in performance means that's the time to get rid of the cap hit. If he was performing still great, I'd be okay having him make a lot of money, although that's not where I would have spent that money originally. I'm almost always going to pursue high performance, even if it means a high cap hit. But now that performance is going down, that's definitely the time to get rid of the cap hit. Because I've seen a lot of different national media say, oh, it's a really high cap hit, so we need to get rid of him. And I don't think that should always be the first position. I think it should always be performance first. Because there's ways to manipulate the cap to get it to where you need it to go over the course of seasons.
Yep. Where do you sit with Patrick Peterson?
That's a great question. I definitely think we need to be drafting corners in the draft again, which I feel like we're having this conversation every year. From the moment it became a joke under Zimmer, like, oh, you can't always draft cornerbacks, now it became an issue where we need to draft cornerbacks. And I definitely think Duke Shelley is on a starter role if we can re-sign him. A lot of people are saying, hey, he should be the starter. It does go with an asterisk that we do need to sign him. He is a free agent right now. So there's a chance that he could get paid $1 higher than we're willing to spend. So that's something to keep an eye on, which I think definitely then translates into who else do you bring back? So if you can keep Duke Shelley, then obviously you need one other starting cornerback. And I really struggle with Cam Dantzler because I've been rooting for him for a long time, but now that he's gone through two personnel sets between the Zimmer regime and the Kevin O'Connell regime, he's had issues with both. And I haven't been in the room, so I don't want to necessarily speak for what's exactly going on, but that is a leading indicator for me that something else is not perfect. So that tells me that maybe you should be pursuing another outside starting cornerback.
Yeah. He's actually, from what I can tell, he's not as expensive as you might assume he would be, given his credentials, where he was drafted and his profile.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think the decline in ability and production is precipitous. I mean, it's part of the reason why it was so easy to get chunk plays against the Vikings, I think, was because Peterson just isn't what he used to be, and because he has so much natural talent, experience, and wisdom, I think he can, it's a lot like for anyone who follows golf, like when Tiger Woods goes back to Augusta, it's like he's played that course so many times. He's won there so many times. He's so confident there that he can play it a lot better than someone else with Tiger's age, injury history, and a current ability would be able to play it, because he's got all the intangible qualities. And that's what Peterson has. However, over the balance of a season, 800 snaps, 700 snaps, I think that's a weak point. And you got to get better there. And if you're not getting better there, I don't think you're getting better as a defense. I think it's a bad sign for your defense. So another hard decision perhaps is to let him go. And it'd be great if you could say, no, we're going to keep him in the room. He's a good leader and all that. But it's like, but I mean, you're not going to make him inactive. Like, Peterson's not going to stick around here to be inactive on game days, no. And you only get so many guys active on game days. So you can't, do right by him by not making him, embarrass him and make him active, but then not play him, because now you're wasting a roster spot. So
and you don't make him cornerback 3 either, right? I don't bench Patrick Peters. I mean, if you could, that'd be best case scenario if he was your backup, but where he's still active and dressed, but not the starting cornerback. But definitely an issue, because I think although he played fairly decent this year, I think we kind of papered over his position to accentuate what he was good at, versus
Uh-huh.
if we can find another cornerback that can have a higher ceiling, that would almost always be the best case scenario, right? Where
Yes.
there's a lot of cornerbacks that Patrick Peterson I would want a lot more than a lot of other quarterbacks, but the priority is to make this better. Where if we can't improve it, then I say bring him back. If we're not confident in the cornerback room when it comes to the draft, bring him back, because we definitely don't want to get worse in that category, but the priority is getting
Yep.
better.
Yep. All right. So, what we set out to do here on the very first part of this segment, as we drill down on the Vikings defense and talk personnel, was we know there's a big variable, a big elephant in the room, and that is who's going to be the coordinator, and that will dictate what happens with a lot of the personnel. But what we wanted to do was identify some decisions that needed to be made regardless of who the coordinator was. And so that's where we talked about Harrison Smith, Eric Kendricks, and Patrick Peterson. Is there anyone else, Gyles, who fits that profile before we move on and identify the guys who we aren't going to stand on the table for or against until we know who the coordinator is? Because I think there's 2 or 3 of those guys. But is there anyone in this former category where it's like, no matter who the coordinator is, this is what you should do with that player?
I don't know if there's an automatic what do we do with this player, but I do think it is a question number one when you sit down with a defensive coordinator. When you ask them a whole slew of questions about what you want to do, one of those is, what do you do with Danielle Hunter? Do we keep him? Do we move on with him?
To me, he's the to me, he's the number one. He's the number one player that we should talk about once we know who the coordinator is.
Yeah.
That's when you and I can talk about what should happen with Hunter.
Yep.
So because there is a scenario, Gyles, where I would say, no, you gotta keep Hunter. He's on the team. You got to keep him, and you got to find a role for him. Depending on who you hire, I might say that about Danielle Hunter. But if you hire a different type of person to come in here and run the show on defense, I might be saying, who wants Hunter? Who can you trade him to?
Yep.
Seattle, New Orleans, LA. So to me, it's hard to talk about Danielle until I know who the coordinator is. Yeah, do you feel that way, or do you think okay?
I feel entirely in agreement, because it depends on your game plan with him. There is a route to having him be very successful on this team, but it does require the right coordinator and the right scheme.
Okay. Two more names then that I want to bring up, who I would say similar things about, and that would be Danielle's running mate, Za'Darius Smith. Yep. I understand the investment required if you want to keep Za'Darius. It is a massive cap hit of $21.6 million.
Yeah.
That's huge. So, easy to say, yeah, he's gone. We'll save that money. Now, you don't save all of it. There's some dead cap involved, but Za'Darius, before he got hurt, I think was a difference maker for you. And so
number one in pressures for a while.
Yeah, it's very plausible that you get a Flores in here or Raheem Morris or someone who's going to run a 3-4. It's very plausible that you're going to extend Za'Darius somehow.
Yep.
Find some cash somewhere.
Yep.
Give him some cash, push his cap hit down the road, absorb it later, and you run with Za'Darius as your guy, right?
Yep, because if you're Brian Flores, if you're just trying to walk through this logically, and you analyze the current roster and the ability to make moves this offseason, which any team can do, but there's a limit to how many moves you can make and who you can draft in the draft. Going back to our original statement, what do you hang your hat on? If I need to have an elite strength here, where is it? And I don't necessarily see our secondary going from worst to first overnight. Even if you could draft a Sauce Gardner, I don't think your secondary is going from worst to first, period. You can get better, don't get me wrong, but if you want to be elite in a category, I truly think having your defensive line be elite is the easiest plausible route, which then I think requires you to keep both players. Now, obviously, you do need to do some maneuvering and really explore what does that look like to exploit both of their strengths, but I think that is the easiest route, quote unquote, to becoming elite.
Okay, agreed. So let's table our discussion on Za'Darius and Danielle for now. The last one I want to bring up, though, and I get a sense that we may be on opposite ends of this one. Let's see if I'm right or not. Is Jordan Hicks. Have you already made your decision on what to do with Jordan Hicks, or are you interested to see who the coordinator is before you make that decision?
I think a coordinator has to do a lot with what you do with pretty much every player. But if I'm leaning one way or the other, I'm leaning towards getting rid of him. I like Jordan Hicks a lot.
Yep.
I think he's a tremendous tackler, does great in pass rush, which is not something we necessarily used him a lot for. Great stout player, but very slow. And I think if you're going to maintain this existing scheme and build on it, I think you have all but written him off. If you're going to move to a different scheme, maybe there's a place for him, but he's very slow. And I think that's an area where we need to improve this offseason is speed. Now, I could be talked into keeping him, but I think if you're leaning one way or the other, I think he is no longer to be in purple.
All right. I'm not right now. I'm not going to try to talk you into keeping him
Okay.
because I want to see what they're doing on defense and what the plan is.
Okay.
But I think I'm going to be on the side of keeping him.
Okay.
And the main argument for it is I don't want to have a fear-based argument because you should never operate out of, fear. Like, but it's the then what? If not Hicks, then what? And
That's
I
very
want to
true.
know what the plan is behind him. And I'm not saying the cupboard is bare at inside linebacker at all, but I would be on the side of moving on from Kendricks. And so that sort of strengthens Hicks' position, I believe, for one more year on the roster.
I can definitely hear that argument, especially if you move on to Brian Asamoah, who will be, for all intents and purposes, still a rookie, keeping some experience on that level. So you can't be as easily exploited by a good quarterback, recognizing a brand new middle linebacker room. So I'll definitely hear that argument. Yeah. Unless you can find a replacement that's better, like we were mentioning before, then he's worth keeping.
So, okay. And so on that topic though, Gyles, I don't think it will be hard to go to the market and find an upgrade over Hicks. However, I think it will cost you. Yeah, exactly. It will cost you. So, and Hicks isn't free. He's six. No. I think his hit is $6.5 million. But I think that's a sensible number for a guy like Hicks. Like that's a good signing at the time for the Vikings. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I applauded it.
Yeah. So I think he came in here and he did exactly what the Vikings hoped he would do. And, but I think we need more. We need some variables to turn into knowns before we know what to do with Hicks, in my view. So I put him in there with Za'Darius and Daniil as I need to know what the plan is before I decide what to do with Hicks.
Yep. I agree. And I think that should be spread across the entire roster. Like, if we can do better, let's do it. But recognizing, even in the quarterback position, a lot of people are saying the check down in 4th and 8, let's get rid of him. All right, well then what is next, right? Because you might be wasting a few years of Justin Jefferson's time if you choose to get way worse at that category, right?
Yep.
So I think it's important to note that across every position. Like, let's try to improve, but if you cannot improve, then maybe let's stay put. Yeah, I think that's a very valuable, wise comment.
So another thing I wanted to talk about in this segment, Gyles, we've sort of already hit on, and that is who on the roster do you want to elevate? And you've talked about some of your favorites, and so have I. So I think we can sort of move on from this one, but I did want to broach the topic in case there was someone who has not yet been mentioned. And you mentioned Asamoah. We both are on Metellus and Duke Shelley. We haven't touched a lot on the interior. Although I must say there's no one that I'm super excited about either on the interior. I'm excited about a Caleb Evans. I'm excited about Duke Shelley. And I know you're excited perhaps about Andrew Booth. So I think we've hit on a lot of these young guys that we hope are elevated, but I did want to broach it in case there was someone we haven't mentioned yet on defense.
I think someone that's in for a decent next year would be Kyrie's Tonga. He had a pretty good year. There was definitely some downs. I don't want to say he was elite in every category, but he showed some real good flashes where he had some unfortunate plays that really dinged him in tackling, which is definitely something you have to shore up when you're an interior defensive lineman. But every other category, I mean, he ended the year at a 77.9 PFF grade when he played almost 300 snaps. So that's nothing to shake a stick over. I think there's some real opportunity with that, especially when you can get younger and cheaper and still maintain some good performance. Because I believe Harrison Smith and Dalvin Tomlinson are both at least above average from the interior perspective. but they're also fairly expensive. So that's where, if you are going to move off of them this offseason, you need to at least keep your performance where it is. And I think Kyrie's Tonga is the only guy on the roster right now that would be able to do that.
Got it. All right. To wrap up this segment, I want to give you a list of names who are prospective free agents. And then I want us to talk about these players next week.
All right.
Okay. And we can look at what we remember about watching them play. Mm-hmm. We can look at PFF data, hint, hint. But I want to talk about these players next week because they're free agents. But I want to table the discussion in the same way I want to table it for Danielle Hunter, Zadarius Smith, and Jordan Hicks. I want to know who the boss is before I have hard and fast opinions on these guys. But are you ready to write them down?
Let's do it.
All right. Cam Sutton, Steelers.
Yep.
Charles Amenahu, Niners.
Ooh, okay. Yep.
Javon Hargrave, Eagles.
Ooh, Hargrave. Okay. Yep.
And Ashawn Robinson, Rams. Okay.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we'll definitely come to the table with some thoughts and perspectives.
So our homework is okay. Good. Our homework is to study those guys. They are likely to be free agents, who I think the Vikings should think about considering. And if the coordinator is right, they should definitely consider those guys. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like that.
And then hopefully before we record another episode, we will have hired a coordinator. And then I can't wait to hear some of your names for your free agent wish list.
Yeah.
Before we go, Dalvin Tomlinson, are you concerned there about not having him back? Do we have to get him back? Because I think he's a guy that a lot of other teams are going to look at and be like, I'm not sure if he'll be back with the Vikings, and we're kind of interested in that guy. And one thing Rick always talked about, Spielman always talked about was, baseball GMs say sometimes the best trades you make or sometimes the best trades are the ones you don't make. That's what baseball GMs say a lot. And I hear Spielman would always say this, and other GMs would say sometimes the best free agent signings are your own free agents. So that's why I want to talk about Dalvin Tomlinson a little bit before we go. So a minute or so on Tomlinson and what you thought about him this year.
I think he did pretty phenomenal across every game this season. Now, he had some injury that caused him to dip in availability and performance, but when healthy and available, he did very, very, very well. So, for example, when you look at his overall grades through the season, he ended at a 77.1 grade. Did great in pass rush, did pretty good in run defense, did at least serviceable in tackling. Apparently, he did fairly well in coverage, apparently. Yep. So the point is, he was an above average interior defensive lineman. And this is one of those categories where, you have to factor in all the offseason moves together to know where you have some flexibility. But if you have the ability to bring him back, that is one I will bring back, because I don't want to get worse in the rush game when it comes to run defense. And he was a pretty phenomenal piece of our run defense. Even the threat of Dalvin Tomlinson was big. Now, although I believe Kyrie's Tonga can be a good player to step up, I don't want to get rid of Dalvin Tomlinson, regardless of scheme. I think he's a great interior defensive lineman, and if you can generate pressure on the outside, it's also important to generate pressure on the interior as well, and then both of them help out the other. So I think you need to maintain that type of rush, and Dalvin Tomlinson is one of those players that can do that. Now, if you can upgrade and for the same amount of pay, do that, but I don't know if there's many players that could actually fit that bill.
I think it'd be hard to do that. And
unless you're going to get Aaron Donald somehow and fit him into your scheme.
There you go. Hey, he's got a Rams connection now. Bring Raheem Morris. Bring Raheem Morris here.
He did change his Twitter to say former Rams defensive lineman.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe that means he's coming to the Vikings.
That's right. Exactly right. All right. Fun discussion here. The last segment I had sort of designated Gyles for overall, what do you and I want to see for the Vikings defense from a traits and a style standpoint? But I think we've kind of talked a lot about that already. And we know what fans want. They want more aggressive, right? Well, every fan wants that every year. And so do we.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different ways to define what aggressive is.
Yeah. I think a lot of fans look at that as like, oh, to be aggressive means you blitz a lot, and I think that's a very immature perspective of
Yeah,
aggressiveness.
I
It's
think it
a
is.
very face value. I
Yeah.
think if I'm answering what I think the Vikings need to tackle in this next offseason and over the next few seasons is our ability to be tough. Now, recognize that's also kind of an esoteric type response, but if you look at teams like the Steelers or teams like the 49ers or the Cowboys, now there may be a few blip seasons here and there, but they're almost always coming to the table as a very stout team where teams that play them have a very poor record the next week. I think there should
Yeah.
be a little bit of a priority on being fast, that is one, but also being very tough and playing very physical. I think that can make up for other deficiencies. So if you can get more tough as a defense, I think there is some additional W's to be had in the next offseason and seasons to come.
All right. I think you're right about that. I totally agree. And you're right. It's a big boy, physical, tough, hard game. Every game is, no matter what
Yep.
two teams are playing. But there is no doubt that every year there are teams, and sometimes it's two or three, sometimes it's a handful, that assert themselves as that's a really physical team. And when you play them, you feel it, and you
Yeah.
feel it the next week,
Yeah.
and
Elite in tackling.
yep, elite in tackling. They're tough, and the more traits you can get, tough, strong, fast, smart, physical, we get it. You want all those things, but it's very hard to be good at all of those things, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
and you can be really fast and really smart. You're not so strong, and that can work. But you can also be really smart and really strong, but you're kind of slow, and that can work too. So there's no one right way to do it. But you need to have an idea and an identity of what you're going to forte in, right? Like, this is what our major is, and this is what we're going to do. And
Yep.
so what I want for the Vikings defense is for them to identify what that is and then to go and get it,
Yep.
or to develop it. That's
Yep.
what I want them to do. And it doesn't matter to me if they're just going to be known for being really fast and great in coverage, or if they're going to be known for being really physical and strong and tough up front, whatever. Both of those will work.
Pick one. Yeah.
Yep. But pick one and
Yep.
be it.
Yep. And
then
draft
be
for it.
that. Yes. Yeah.
Free agency signings, draft, prioritize that type of element in all of your players.
Exactly.
And if we're taking Quezzy for his word in the past off seasons, I really do think they might prioritize speed and smarts.
Oh, yeah?
Based on his comments.
Okay, interesting. Well, it'll be fun to keep watching it. Now, I do want to keep a defensive flavor to the Wobcast 2.0 here in season 2. So, unless news warrants it, Gyles, I think we'll continue to hit on the Vikings defense next week when we talk more Vikings offseason here on the Wobcast 2.0. So I think this was a really good starting point for our discussion about how to improve the Vikings defense. I think we're on the same page about some of the things we saw that we didn't like and some of the things we think should get better. And as importantly, some of the things that are good that they should hang on to and should continue to develop. So the major thing to watch, though, is who the defensive coordinator is. Can't wait for that news to drop. And once it does, we'll be able to talk about it here on the Wobcast 2.0. Anything else from your notebook you want to empty out before we go?
No, hopefully we can get Mr. Morris over here in a defensive posture.
I agree. I'm kind of like, I'm a little more enthusiastic about that now than I was. Like, it was a passing thought for me, Gyles, honestly, for this week once they got rid of Donatel, which, I wasn't like going to stand on the table to defend Donatel, but I also was like, you could have had, you could have Chuck Noll up in this thing last year, and I just don't think the players executed very well, No. So, I mean,
Correct.
And so whatever, Donatel's gone, and that's too bad for him. I hope he moves on and finds another job and has great success. But that's neither here nor there. The Vikings decided to move on. So, but yeah, it was just a passing thought of mine that Raheem Morris could come over and do it. But you got me kind of excited about it. Not as excited as I would be if it was Zimmer, though.
Yeah. Zimmer for DC. We'll start a campaign.
Can I get a yard sign? Can you bring a yard sign over?
I love that. We'll get them printed this afternoon.
Okay. All right. Well, that's going to do it for episode 1 of season 2 of the Wobcast 2.0. We're glad that you guys were here to take it in. Remember, you can find all of the past Wobcasts, the current one, and the future Wobcasts wherever you find all your favorite podcasts: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, at Wobby on Twitter, therealwobcast@gmail.com. We don't want you to just passively listen. We want you to participate. So those are the ways you can get in touch with us, dictate some of the content that is on the Wobcast 2.0. On behalf of executive producer Chase and on behalf of Gyles, this is Wobby signing off for now. Skol Vikings.